Module 2 The Consequences of Dissension. Lesson 4 Persuasions on the Power of the Word. The writers are Salman Rushdie and Toni Morrison. Salman Rushdie, a British Indian essayist and novelist, was born in a Muslim family of Kashmiri descent as the only son of a businessman and schoolteacher. Rushdie read history for his MA at the University of Cambridge. He lived briefly in Pakistan in 1964 and worked as a television writer. He returned to England in 1970s and worked as a copywriter for an advertising agency. Rushdie published his first book, Grimace, in 1975, which was a fantasy and sci-fi novel. His monumental second work, Midnight's Children, 1981, has won several honors including the Best of the Bookers. His 1983 novel, Shame, won the French Literary Prize. In 1988, Rushdie published his controversial novel, The Satanic Verses, in 1988, a magical realist story relating to the Prophet's life. Religious fundamentalists issued a fatwa or a death sentence against him and burnt his books. In spite of the constraints that were imposed on him, he continues to write copiously. He has written 11 novels including Joseph Anton Amamea, 2012. He has also written for children, such as his book Haroun and the Sea of Stories, 1990, and non-fiction, including the collection Imaginary Homelands, Essays and Criticism, 1981 to 1991, published in 1991. He has received several honorary doctorates and fellowships, including a knighthood. He was the president of PEN American Center from 2004 to 2006, an organization that promotes free speech. His writing has a distinct style that combines magical realism with historical fiction. Own censorship is drawn from the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture delivered by Salman Rushdie on May 6, 2012 as part of the PEN World Voices Festival. As a writer who has had to live under the threatening shadow of a fatwa, Rushdie knows the price that's paid for free speech. He reminds artists that thought-provoking art should contain an element of rebellion and agitation. Art, when censored, alters the artist's original vision. He argues that art withstands its censor, but the onus is on the artists who are vulnerable. PEN International is an organization founded in 1921 and is an acronym for poets, playwrights, editors, essayists, novelists, which includes journalists and historians. They aim to bring diverse voices from around the world to ask questions about humanity, freedom, and the role of writers, is quoted by Rushdie. Own Censorship by Salman Rushdie. No writer ever really wants to talk about censorship. Writers want to talk about creation, and censorship is anti-creation, negative energy, uncreation, the bringing into being of non-being, or, to use Tom Stoppart's description of death, the absence of presence. Censorship is a thing that stops you doing what you want to do. And what writers want to talk about is what they do, not what stops them doing it. And writers want to talk about how much they get paid. And they want to gossip about other writers and how much they get paid. And they want to complain about critics and publishers and gripe about politicians. And they want to talk about what they love, the writers they love, the stories, and even sentences that have meant something to them. And finally, they want to talk about their own ideas and their own stories. Their things. The British humorist Paul Jennings, in his brilliant essay on resistentialism, a spoof of existentialism, proposed that the world was divided into two categories, thing and no thing, and suggested that between these two is waged a never-ending war. If writing is thing, then censorship is no thing, and as King Lear told Cordelia, nothing will come of nothing. Or, as Mr. Jennings would have revised Shakespeare, no thing will come of no thing. Think again. Consider, if you will, the air. Here it is, all around us, plentiful, freely available, and broadly breathable. And yes, I know, it's not perfectly clean or perfectly pure, but here it is nevertheless, plenty of it. enough for all of us and lots to spare. When breathable air is available so freely and in such quantity, it would be redundant to demand that breathable air be freely provided to all in sufficient quantity for the needs of all. What you have, you can easily take for granted and ignore. There is just no need to make a fuss about it. You breathe the freely available, broadly breathable air, and you get on with your day. The air is not a subject. It's not something that most of us want to discuss. Imagine now that somewhere up there you might find a giant set of faucets, and that the air we breathe flows from those faucets, hot air and cold air and tepid air from some celestial mixer unit. And imagine that an entity up there, not known to us, or perhaps even known to us, begins on a certain day to turn off the faucets one by one, so that slowly we begin to notice that the available air, still breathable, still free, is thinning. The time comes when we find that we are breathing more heavily, perhaps even gasping for air. By this time, many of us would have begun to protest, to condemn the reduction in the air supply, and to argue loudly for the right to freely available, broadly breathable air. Scarcity, you could say, creates demand. Liberty is the air we breathe, and we live in a part of the world where, imperfect as the supply is, it is nevertheless freely available, at least to those of us who are in black youngsters wearing hoodies in Miami, and broadly breathable, unless, of course, we are women in red states trying to make free choices about our own bodies. Imperfectly free, imperfectly breathable, but when it is breathable and free, we don't need to make a song and dance about it. We take it for granted and get on with our day. And at night, as we fall asleep, we assume we'll be free tomorrow because we were free today. The creative act requires not only freedom but also this assumption of freedom. If the creative artist worries if he'll still be free tomorrow, then he'll not be free today. If he's afraid of the consequences of his choice of subject or his manner of treatment of it, then his choices will not be determined by his talent but by fear. If we are not confident of our freedom, then we are not free. And even worse than that, when censorship intrudes on art, it becomes a subject. The art becomes censored art. And that's how the world sees and understands it. The censor labels the work immoral, or blasphemous, or pornographic, or controversial, and those words are forever hung like albatrosses around the necks of those cursed mariners, the censored works. The attack on the work does more than define the work. In a sense, for the general public, it becomes the work. For every reader of Lady Chatterley's Lover or Tropic of Capricorn, every viewer of Last Tango in Paris or A Clockwork Orange, there'll be 10, 100, 1,000 people who know these works as excessively filthy or excessively violent or both. Toni Morrison, American novelist, essayist, editor, and emeritus professor, was born Chloe Anthony Wofford in Ohio to parents who took great pride in their black heritage. She received MA in 1955 from Cornell University in Ithaca and taught English at the Texas Southern University in Houston. Her marriage with the Jamaican architect Harold Morrison in 1958, 2 sons later, ended in divorce. Struggling with her circumstances, she joined Random House New York as an associate editor in 1964, eventually serving as a senior editor for 20 years. Some of her major novels are The Bluest Eye, 1970, Zula, 1973, Songs of Solomon, 1977, Tar Baby, 1981, Beloved, 1987, and Jazz, 1992. She was given the Pulitzer Prize in 1988 for Beloved, the Nobel Prize in 1993, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012, and the PEN Soulbellow Award for Achievement in American Fiction in 2016. The Nobel jury called her an artist who, in novel, characterized by visionary force and poetic import, gives life to an essential aspect of American reality. She is a strong advocate of free speech and feminism. Toni Morrison's introductory essay titled Peril in the anthology Burn This Book, also edited by her, was first presented as a speech on censorship at the Penn International Festival in 2008. The extract challenges restrictive thinking about literary creation and consumption. She articulates that right-thinking people should protect the written word and steadfastly root for its power to inspire and transform, as there is danger for despots caused by a writer's existence and danger to truth caused by a writer's persecution. She adopts two techniques to convey the power writers possess: the repetition of keywords and the altering of voice. Peril by Toni Morrison. Authoritarian regimes, dictators, despots are often, but not always, fools. But none is foolish enough to give perceptive, dissident writers free range to publish their judgments or follow their creative instincts. They know they do so at their own peril. They are not stupid enough to abandon control, overt or insidious, over media. Their methods include surveillance, censorship, arrest, even slaughter of those writers informing and disturbing the public. Writers who are unsettling, calling into question, taking another deeper look. Writers, journalists, essayists, bloggers, poets, playwrights can disturb the social oppression that functions like a coma on the population. A coma, despots call peace, and they stanch the blood flow of war that hawks and profiteers thrill to. That is their peril. Ours is of another sort. How bleak, unlivable, insufferable existence becomes when we are deprived of artwork? That the life and work of writers facing peril must be protected is urgent, but along with that urgency, we should remind ourselves that their absence, the choking off of a writer's work, its cruel amputation, is of equal peril to us. The rescue we extend to them is a generosity to ourselves. We all know nations that can be identified by the flight of writers from their shores. These are regimes whose fear of unmonitored writing is justified because truth is trouble. It's trouble for the warmonger, the torturer, the corporate thief, the political hack, the corrupt justice system, and for a comatose public. Unpersecuted, unjailed, unharassed writers are trouble for the ignorant bully, the sly racist, and the predators feeding off the world's resources. The alarm, the disquiet writers raise is instructive because it's open and vulnerable, because if unpoliced, it is threatening. Therefore, the historical suppression of writers is the earliest harbinger of the steady peeling away of additional rights and liberties that will follow. The history of persecuted writers is as long as the history of literature itself, and the efforts to censor, starve, regulate, and annihilate us are clear signs that something important has taken place. Cultural and political forces can sweep clean all but the safe, all but state-approved art. I have been told that there are two human responses to the perception of chaos: naming and violence. When the chaos is simply the unknown, the naming can be accomplished effortlessly. A new spacious star, formula, equation, prognosis. There is also mapping, charting, or devising proper nouns for unnamed or stripped of names geography, landscape, or population. When chaos resists, either by reforming itself or by rebelling against imposed order, violence is understood to be the most frequent response and the most rational when confronting the unknown, the catastrophic, the wild, wanton, or incorrigible. Rational responses may be censure, incarceration in holding camps, prisons, or death singly or in war. There is, however, a third response to chaos, which I have not heard about, which is stillness. Such stillness can be passivity and dumbfoundedness. It can be paralytic fear, but it can also be art. Those writers plying their craft near to or far from the throne of raw power, of military power, of empire building and counting houses, writers who construct meaning in the face of chaos must be nurtured, protected. And it is right that such protection be initiated by other writers. And it is imperative not only to save the best writers but to save ourselves. The thought that leads me to contemplate with dread the erasure of other voices, of unwritten novels, poems whispered or swallowed for fear of being overheard by the wrong people, outlawed languages nourishing underground, essays, questions, challenging authority never being paused, unstaged plays, cancelled films. That thought is a nightmare, as though a whole universe is being described in invisible ink. Certain kinds of trauma visited on peoples are so deep, so cruel, that unlike money, unlike vengeance, even unlike justice or rights or the goodwill of others, only writers can translate such trauma and turn sorrow into meaning, sharpening the moral imagination. A writer's life and work are not a gift to mankind, they are its necessity. The Burning of the Books, Bertolt Brecht. Bertolt Brecht, 1898 to 1956, poet, playwright, theatre director, social critic, was born Eugen Berthold Friedrich Brecht in Augsburg, Bavaria. His father worked in a paper mill, and his mother was a religious woman who ensured that he learned the Bible. He wrote poetry in school, but enrolled to study medicine at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich in 1917. After being drafted for military service during the First World War, he abandoned his medical studies to pursue writing and the theatre. A member of the Independent Social Democratic Party, Brecht wrote theatre criticism from 1919 to 1921. His plays were banned in Germany in the 1930s, and he went into exile in 1933. His books were among those publicly burned in Berlin. He moved to Denmark, Finland, and then to California. Although he managed to deflect the accusation of being a communist, he moved to Switzerland after the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings. He relocated to East Berlin in 1949 and ran the Berliner Ensemble, a theatre company. As a director, he advocated the alienation effect in acting, an approach intended to keep the audience emotionally uninvolved in the plights of the characters. Brecht's poetry is collected in Poems 1913 to 1956 and Poetry and Prose Bertolt Brecht. He wrote a wide variety of poetry, including poems he set to music and performed, songs and poems for his plays, personal poems recording anecdotes and thoughts, and political poems. He was awarded the prestigious Clades Prize in 1922 for his first three plays, Baal, Drums in the Night, and In the Jungle. Mother Courage and Her Children, The Good Woman of Zedzon, and The Caucasian Chalk Circle are some of his other memorable plays. The poem The Burning of the Books is a tragicomic protest against censorship and ignorance. It reflects the reaction of many to the Nazi policy of burning literature they disapproved of. Literature from Jewish, communist, socialist, pacifist, and anarchist authors were subject to destruction under the Nazi regime. The practice began in 1933 and was considered a way of cleansing the country ideologically and ridding it of un-German material. The poem opens with an image of such book-burning pogroms. A writer in exile finds that his works have not been selected for persecution and demands in a letter to the powers that be for his name to be added to the condemned list of writers. Brecht's clever use of irony makes the difference in the writer's words between the burning of his books and himself indistinguishable. The poem also subverts the act intended to destroy and suppress inconvenient facts or truth into the very thing that verifies and validates the reality writers attempt to record in their works. The poet-writer persona defiantly stands in solidarity with the victims of fascist oppression. The burning of the books. When the regime commanded the unlawful books to be burned, Teams of dull oxen hauled huge cartloads to the bonfires. Then a banished writer, one of the best, scanning the list of excommunicated texts, became enraged. He had been excluded. He rushed to his desk, full of contemptuous wrath, to write fierce letters to the morons in power. "Burn me!" he wrote with his blazing pen. "Haven't they always reported the truth? Now here you are, treating me like a liar. Burn me!" The Censors, Luisa Valenzuela. Luisa Valenzuela was born in Argentina to Pablo Francisco Valenzuela, a doctor, and Luisa Mercedes Levinson, a prominent Argentine writer. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Buenos Aires. She began her career as a journalist. She wrote her first story when she was just 17. She wrote for several magazines in Buenos Aires and worked with literary luminaries like George Louis Borges. In 1958, she married Theodore Merchak, a French merchant marine, and moved to France where their daughter was born, and she began writing her first novel. She returned to Buenos Aires in 1961 and worked as an editor at La Nación. In 1965, she and her husband divorced. In 1966, her first novel, Clara, was published. She attended the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop on a Fulbright grant in 1969 and published The Efficient Cat. When the political situation in Argentina became volatile with the national reorganization process under military dictatorship, which partially censored her novel He Who Searches, she left for the US and stayed there for 10 years. She says, "I decided to leave in order not to fall into self-censorship. Exile may be devastating, but perspective and separation sharpen the aim." Valenzuela has published 6 novels and 8 collections of short stories, and many of her works have been translated into other languages. She conducts writing workshops and has taught Latin American literature at universities in the US and has won many awards, notably the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1983. The short story The Censors was published in 1976 in a bilingual collection of fiction, The Censors. It's set in the backdrop of the military coup in Argentina following the death of President Juan Perón. The new dictatorship of José Videla, who reigned from 1976 to 1983, severely restricted constitutional liberties, killing people who opposed the junta and imposing strict censorship laws for its citizens. 13 to 15,000 citizens were killed in the Dirty War, as it was later called. In the story, Juan, a young man living in Argentina, writes a letter to the woman he loves, named Mariana, whose new address he has received, but is worried that censors might find the contents of the letter objectionable and thus engender Mariana besides himself. He comes up with an ingenious plan to intercept the letter by joining the Censors Secret Command Center, a bureaucratic agency that inspects the contents of each letter for bombs, poisonous powders, and secret encodings. He quickly learns the ropes at his new job and makes it to the upper levels through his devotion to his work. He finally gets his hand on the long-anticipated letter, which, being the perfect censor, he rejects and denounces. His superiors execute him the next day. The story is written in the form of a satire against the authoritarian control of people through censorship, which creates profound stresses in the mental states of the individuals. They become so fearful of the government machinery that they self-censor their own actions and thoughts, though harmless, to conform. The story reveals the fate of individuals living under the rule of a repressive government. It explores how self-imposed censorship turns people against each other, against themselves. The Censors. Poor Juan. He was caught off guard that day, and he couldn't realize that what he thought was a stroke of luck was really an accursed trick of fate. Those things happen when you're not careful, and as sure as you're hearing me, one gets careless very, very often. Juan Soto let happiness, an otherwise disturbing sentiment, overwhelm him when from a confidential source he received Mariana's new address, now in Paris, and he knew that she hadn't forgotten him. Without thinking twice, he sat down at his desk and wrote a letter. The letter, the same one that now prevents him from concentrating on his work during the day and doesn't let him sleep when night comes. What did he put in that letter? What heart stuck to that sheet of paper that he sent to Mariana? Juan knew there wouldn't be any problem with the text, that the text is irreproachable, innocuous, but the rest? He knows that they probe the letters, sniff them, feel them, read between the lines and their insignificant punctuation, even the accidental stains. He knows that the letters pass from hand to hand through the vast censorship bureaus and that few finally pass the test and are able to continue their journey. Usually, it's a question of months, years if complications arise, a long time in which the freedom and perhaps even the life of the sender and receiver are in suspense. And that's what has our Juan so deeply depressed, the idea that something could happen to Mariana in Paris through his fault. Mariana, of all people, who must feel so safe, so at ease there where she always dreamed of living. But he knows that the secret commandos of censorship operate the world over and are granted a large discount on airline fares. Therefore, there is nothing to prevent them from going even to the darkest Paris quarter, kidnap Mariana, and go home convinced of the nobility of their earthly mission. So you have to outsmart them. You have to do what everyone does. Try to sabotage the mechanism. Throw sand in the gears that go to the source of the problem in order to obstruct it. That was the plan when Juan, like so many others, applied to be a censor. Not because of conviction like a few others, or because he needed work like still others. No, he applied simply in order to try to intercept his own letter. Not at all an original idea, but a comforting one. He was hired immediately because more censors are needed every day, and there is no time to be squeamish about references. The Directorate of Censorship was aware of the secret motive behind the desire of more than one to work in the Bureau, but they were in no condition to be too strict, and anyway, what for? They knew how difficult it would be for those poor innocents to find the letter they were looking for. And even if they did, what importance does a letter or two that slips through the barrier cracks compared to the others that the new censor would shoot down? That's how Juan was able to join the Censorship Bureau of the Ministry of Communications. The building, seen from outside, had a festive air because of the smoked glass that reflected the sky, an air that was in total contrast to the austere atmosphere of its interior. And little by little, Juan became accustomed to the climate of concentration which his new work required, and the knowledge that he was doing everything possible for his letter, that is, for Mariana, assuaged his anxieties. He wasn't even worried when, the first month, he was assigned to Section K, where the envelopes are opened with painstaking care to see if they contain some explosive. It's true that on the third day, a letter blew a fellow worker's hand off and disfigured his face, but the bureau chief claimed it had been mere negligence on the victim's part, and Juan and the other employees could continue working as before, although with much less assurance. At quitting time, another fellow worker tried to organize a strike to demand more pay for hazardous work, but Juan didn't participate, and after thinking it over a while, he denounced him to the authorities in order to be promoted. Once doesn't form a habit, Juan thought as he left the chief's office, and when they transferred him to Section J, where they unfold the letters with infinite care to see if they contain poisonous powders, he felt that he had ascended a step and could therefore return to his healthy habit of not getting involved in external affairs. From J, thanks to his merits, he rose rapidly until reaching E, where the work became more interesting, for there begins the reading and analysis of the letters. In that section, he could even cherish hopes of coming across his own missive written to Mariana, which, judging by the time elapsed, should have reached this level after a very long procession through the other departments. Little by little, there were days when his work so absorbed him that the noble mission that brought him to the bureau became momentarily blurred. Days of crossing out long paragraphs with red ink, of tossing many letters into the contempt basket. Days of horror at the subtle and scheming ways people found to transmit subversive messages. Days of intuition so sharp that behind a simple "the weather is unsettled" or "prices are sky high," he detected the vacillating hand of someone whose secret intention was to overthrow the government. So much zeal brought him rapid promotion. We don't know if it made him very happy. In Section B, the amount of letters which reached him daily was minimal. Very few cleared the previous hurdles. But as compensation, he had to read them often, put them under the magnifying glass, look for micro dots with the electronic microscope, and so tune his sense of smell that upon returning home at night he was exhausted. He barely managed to heat up some soup, eat some fruit, and fall asleep with the satisfaction of having complied with his duty. Only his sainted mother worried about him, and tried without success to guide him back onto the right path. She'd say, although it wasn't necessarily true, "Lola called, says she's with the girls in the cafe, that they miss you, were expecting you." But Juan didn't want to have anything to do with known essentials. Any distractions could cause him to lose the astuteness of his senses, and he needed them alert, sharp, attentive, tuned, in order to be the perfect censor and detect deceit. His was a true patriotic labor, self-denying and sublime. His basket of contempt letters soon became the best nourished but also the most subtle in the whole censorship bureau. He was at the point of feeling proud of himself. He was at the point of knowing that he had finally found his true path when his own letter to Mariana reached his hands. Naturally, he condemned it without remorse, and just as naturally, he couldn't prevent them from executing him at dawn, one more victim of his devotion to work.